Hello and welcome everyone to the ReHousIn Lecture series. The lecture series is a project that is from an EU Horizon funding, and it is focusing on rehousing, reducing housing inequalities in 9 different countries. And in these 9 different countries, we have different partners who are focusing on the effects of green transition policies on housing affordability. And the lecture series actually gives a glimpse into the different research outcomes of the 9 different countries and partners. And today we are very happy that we are here at TU Wien and we can give you an insight into the topic of the Viennese housing case studies in Austria. My name is Judith Lehner, and I will now hand over to my colleague, Michael Friesenecker, who will talk about the challenges and also the opportunities that we face when we look at the complex housing system in Vienna.
Thanks, Judith, for the introduction. Exactly, we titled our lecture series, our lecture, not the series, our lecture, Where Climate Goals and Complex Housing Systems Collide, Key Challenges in Vienna. So what I try to do is to give you first a brief outline on what the lecture will cover. So we will start with giving a bit of a context on Vienna and mostly on the housing policies in Vienna and Austria. And then I will give a very brief overview of the greening policies and how they are related to our case studies. Which are 2 of them located in Vienna. It's Innerfavoriten, central district with a mixed tenure where retrofitting and decarbonisation strategies will be discussed. Then this is followed by the case study on Nordbahnhof, but a very specific part of Nordbahnhof actually, where we will discuss nature-based solutions and densification strategies. And all of that in the context of housing inequalities, apparently. And then we will formulate some concluding remarks, some conclusions, and then I will give a brief outlook, and then we can start the discussion. So what is the context in Vienna? So the main context is that Vienna is a strongly growing city. It grew by about 500,000 residents since the 1990s, roughly. And also important to understand housing policies or also housing inequalities is that Vienna is embedded in the federal state of Austria. And it's a municipality and a federal province at once. So this gives the city of Vienna some more responsibilities and power, mostly in terms of housing subsidies, where the city received the full responsibilities for these housing subsidies in 2018, although the devolution from centrally organized housing subsidies already stemmed from 2008. But it's important to note that the city of Vienna has the power over using its housing subsidies as they want, because it's a federal province. What the municipality implies is that they also have full responsibility over urban planning and their instruments like zoning, and other quality assurance instruments that we will hear about later in more detail when we go to the case studies. So next, I want to share insights into the tenure structure and how it changed, and then elaborate a bit on the housing, on the instruments, on the policy instruments which are behind this tenure structure. So what we can see is, with the orange ones, is that social rental is with 40% a very dominant housing tenure. And this has been, the share has been stable since the 1990, 1991. and still is 40% in 2021. What we can see within this tenure is that the light orange, which is limited profit housing associations, sorry, it's the dark orange, not the light orange, kind of grew by 6% percentage points. So it expanded also in total numbers, but also in terms of relative numbers of the housing structure. While the light orange are municipal housing units, so this stems back, and I will go into detail a bit later, to the red Vienna social housing tradition of the city, which dates back to the interwar period. So a second very important segment is the private rental sector, which also expanded from 34% to 39%. And within this, we have like two subsegments. One is rent regulated, rent controlled. This is only the stock that has been built before World War II, so before 1945. And this share declined over the years, while the free regulated rental market expanded from 3% to 15%, which is quite remarkably. So, and also for Vienna, very characteristic is that the ownership market is rather limited compared to other European cities. So it's very stable, and it's about 18–17% as a share on the main residences. And also like owner occupation of apartments is also slightly higher than owning houses. So this is a bit the tenure context that is important also to understand later the case studies. As I said, okay, there are like two different segments in the social housing, and the city over the years since the 1990s actively expanded and maintained its social housing legacy from the interwar period, from the Red Vienna period, but also from the after-war welfare period, where most of the municipal housing stock actually was built. And also compared to other European cities, the city of Vienna never sold its public housing stock, its municipal housing stock, but maintained it, and the stock of about 220,000 housing units is distributed all over the city. But the construction of municipal housing, public housing, ceased in 2004. Now there is like a renewed activity of building what is called a new municipal housing trend, which is more or less falls into the tradition of a limited profit housing organization. But practically municipal housing is rather maintained than expanded. But what the city, with its instruments of zoning and land banking and housing subsidies, did was to develop strategic partnerships with limited profit housing associations and made their kind of instruments in a way that those were the main recipients of housing subsidies, which has some important implications to subsidize those actors which are regulated at a national level, because they offer or they need to adhere to cost-based rents. And when subsidizing them, this also means that after the subsidy period and the loans are being paid back, this still is a regulated rent, the cost-based rent, which is often even lower than the subsidized rent. So that's kind of is the main mechanisms how the city of Vienna expanded its social housing segment over the years. And besides zoning and land banking, as said, housing subsidies are an important element in this, but also the introduced in 1995 developer competitions to steer also the quality and the environmental standards of subsidized housing developments. So this is really a very brief summary of the main policies. What we can also see in Vienna is that the regulated private rental market came under pressure. This goes back to the 90s when the rent control on the national level was deregulated and a reference rent, value rent was introduced. But it's also important to understand that the rent control in Vienna only applies to the housing stock that has been built before 1945, roughly. So this is where the rent control applies, and this has been also undermined by the allowance for time-limited contracts for 3-5 years, and also for surpluses, for instance, for location. So this kind of undermined this very strict rent control system because tenants now need to go to court and legally challenge if their rents are adhering to law. So actually, the tenants need to take care of that. But they are supported by the city of Vienna to a large degree with some counseling, which is offered free. So there's also support for that from the city of Vienna. What is also important to understand is that the tenant security regulation, so how to exit the contract, still applies to the whole private rental segment. So there's a basic regulation of the whole private rental segment. But the effect of this deregulation was that also, and with the expansion of free rental market, is a kind of a shrinking of the regulated private rental houses. And there are several mechanisms behind this, like attic conversions, which does not fall into rent control, although they are on buildings that are rent controlled. There are examples of demolition of old regulated housing and the replacement of new housing, and also kind of an increasing trend to buy-to-let apartments and Airbnbs, but at a much lower scale, probably compared to other European countries. Okay. So let me switch now to, before we delve into the case studies, and this kind of builds a bridge to the case studies, what are the main climate mitigation and adaptation challenges and also policies in Vienna? And there is probably the most pressing one is retrofitting, but mainly decarbonisation of the housing stock, which is replacing gas heating systems that are still individually in the apartments, but also pursuing energy retrofits. Also, an important strategy of the city is to enhance nature-based solutions or urban greening because of climate adaptation. So Vienna faces severe heat waves in summer times, and this has increased considerably in the last years. And there's been a growing awareness that's an issue that needs to be solved at the city level through fostering nature-based solutions. And obviously, this has also a lot to do with kind of a biodiversity loss in cities. Also, that's the reason why also nature-based solutions aim to tackle both kind of crises. And this is done in new developments with parks, with larger green spaces that are mandatory since the 1990s. But increasingly, this is also done via street greening in the historic central areas that are very densely built up. But this is also supported and fostered on buildings with green roofs, mainly as important buffers for extreme stormwater events. And as a third kind of challenge, because of the steep population growth of the city, are densification strategies. So rebuilding or new developments being built on brownfield developments like railway yards that are not needed anymore. And this has been also a major strategy throughout the last 3 decades, probably, to develop this brownfields very strategically. But it is challenged because of, when you have like increasing heat waves, and you still need to do soil sealing, which is mainly developments which heats up again, air and reinforces heat waves, versus also the provision of nature-based solutions in the form of large parks or green spaces that are needed to decrease or to counter at least heat waves and the heating up of the city. So we are now delving into the case studies, and for the next case study, I will hand over to Judith, and she will talk about Innerfavoriten.
Yeah, thank you. So let's zoom into one specific Viennese area, which is Innerfavoriten. The students at TU Vienna have already been there for the last 3 weeks. And as you can see in the aerial picture, it's a really dense neighborhood, very close also to central facilities. And one important aspect is that in close vicinity of this area, there has been the development of the Viennese main train station 15 years ago, and with it also a major urban development on a former brownfield, with new neighborhoods being developed, partially subsidized and partially also privately financed. So there has been a lot of transformation going on the past couple of years. And this has actually also affected the neighborhood. And also the district in Vienna has a very specific setting. It is, on the one hand, a district with a very deeply rooted working class history. Excuse me. There is a high foreign citizenship portion within the district, much higher than the average in Vienna. So it's almost 43% of people having a different citizenship than the Austrian one in this district. The district also has a lower average income than the average income in Vienna. And it's a young district, so it's younger than by average than other Viennese districts in this area. As you might not guess from the aerial picture, it has a very interesting mixture in terms of housing segments and sectors present. So we have, on the one hand, the foundational period, so historic buildings present that have usually been private rental apartments, but there are also in the district as a whole and also in this area, municipal housing estates and also housing estates by limited profit housing companies. And if we now look into this existing structure, it's also very important to understand how the urban renewal process in this in the city of Vienna and in this area was actually happening. And if we look towards urban renewal, renovation procedures, and retrofitting, as we call it today, it's kind of important to understand that Vienna introduced an urban renewal program already in the 1970s. It is based on the Urban Renewal Act, and it was focusing on the huge housing stock that was dilapidated and, as we call it, in substandard. So there was no adequate facilities within the apartments, no running water, no bathroom facilities, sometimes no heating. So it's very important to understand that these almost 40% of the total housing stock needed urgent strategies of repair and renovation in the 70s. And the city of Vienna then developed an urban renewal strategy that was called soft urban renewal, because it was important not just to improve the physical housing stock, but to also kind of keep in mind the soft measures that would prevent displacement of the existing inhabitants and tenants in the buildings. So within 10 years, there was a long procedure of developing the soft urban renewal strategy that on the one hand focused on improving the housing stock, but on the other hand also focused on public space, focused on green areas, and also on participatory measures. So on this space, 10 years after, it was actually then happening that the Land Provision Urban Renewal Fund was introduced as an institution that would give out funds in order to be able to renovate the housing stock. And this housing stock was on the one hand meant for private owner of residential buildings, but it was also including in the subsidy scheme the social rental sector. And one important aspect to point out, linked to the soft urban renewal aspect, was that the subsidies were linked to requirements, for example, such as rent caps and the inability to kind of raise the rents or to kick out the sitting tenants through renovation. I've already mentioned the urban greening aspect of the foundations or the roots of the soft urban renewal. One important aspect that then came in the 1990s was the block renewal. So it was kind of noticed that it's not just important to look at the buildings, but to kind of look at the whole housing block or the city block as an entity and negotiate with the different owners and the different tenants also to kind of think the whole block as an entire infrastructure that maybe could be renovated by pulling synergies in terms of green aspects, which now and in the future will become more important when we talk about energy and energy consumption. In the 2010 years, there was the Thermal Renovation Fund introduced, which heavily looked at energy saving costs. But with the adaptation of the smart city initiatives in the early 2010s, it became clear that the agenda was not just to save energy, but also to reduce CO2 emissions and really look also into climate adaptation measures. Michael also mentioned already the heat waves that are affecting Vienna. So the Smart City Initiative kind of on the one hand looked into how to reduce the CO2 emissions by introducing different types of heating systems, for example, but also into kind of looking into what kind of nature-based solutions are necessary to work with. And then we come closer to the area that we look at, which is the Wien Platz program of Innerfavoriten, which was introduced in 2020 and ran until 2023. And you might want to call it as a urban renewal strategy 2.0, because it doesn't only look at the improvement of buildings in terms of the material infrastructure, but it also looks into how we can actually reduce the CO2 emissions. And within our area, there was also another program or another initiative introduced, which was the Super Block. In Viennese, it's called Superkretzel, which kind of also looked into the greening of public infrastructure in the same area. But we would like to look now more into the retrofitting and renovation aspect in the Innerfavoriten. And it's kind of important to point out that the Wien Platz program focuses on different areas in Vienna one at a time. So the Innerfavoriten area is actually the first area that was chosen for the program. The program will run for 10 years in total. And the first 3 years, it was dedicated to Innerfavoriten. And as we've seen, and as I've already told you, there are many different housing providers in this area. So on the one hand, a large stock of private rental housing, but also a large stock of limited profit housing providers and municipal housing. And the aim of the Wiener Plus program in this area was to kind of find a way to dedicate knowledge on how to decarbonize the housing stock and how to improvise the housing stock for all of these three segments in terms of renovation and decarbonization, but also in terms of circular economy. And then there were additional aims of the program that went hand in hand with it. So another aspect was participation. That was also going back to the roots of the soft urban renewal in the 1970s. So also giving information to tenants about their rights and keeping tenant protection as an important element, but also thinking about social inclusion. And one of the other aims was, for example, innovation and the promotion of pilot projects. So that was also something that was important for the program to kind of push or kind of also promote making pilot projects within the different segments of the program. And I will now also talk about the three different segments, and I will give some review of what kind of elements were important to the municipal housing stock and also to the subsidized housing by the limited profit housing associations. If we look at the municipal housing, for example, the interviews that we conducted during the research project, it clearly showed that there was a clear commitment to decarbonization measures and a clear will to kind of put forward this transformation, also with having in mind that this would also need a lot of tenant information, that it would need kind of involving the tenants in the process. However, we can also see in the interviews that there is a big backlog, on the one hand, due to the large housing stock that the municipal housing provider actually has, and also due to the long processes of renovation. On the one hand, there is a strategy, but on the other hand, there are very long preparation phases until the renovation and the retrofitting can actually happen. In our interviews with different limited housing providers, we saw that there is a huge variety of approaches when it comes to decarbonization measures. So, and also when it comes to tenant participation. So there have been some limited profit housing associations that have a really clear and long-term strategy, what they do with their housing stock in order to reach decarbonization aims. On the other hand, there are other limited profit housing companies that are at the beginning of developing such strategies and processes. So the commitment to the green transition actually depends a lot on the different limited housing providers. What is actually true for both actors is that decarbonization strategies highly depend on subsidies. So there are legally mandatory reserves for renovation measures, but the problem is that these reserves are usually insufficient to manage additional decarbonization or very comprehensive retrofitting procedures. And this makes it very difficult to deal with in a financial aspect. The other one is that the principle of cost-based rent for the limited profit housing providers only allows additional costs to be included in the maintenance and improvement contribution, which is also a legal instrument for, and it can also be asked from tenants through a legal or voluntary procedure, which is not that easy and requires quite a lot of effort from the side of the limited profit housing associations. And then what we heard also in the interviews is that the tenancy law kind of restricts the implementation and construction work on a larger scale, since the tenant does not have to allow workers, for example, to enter the apartment. So the whole complex can only be renovated when apartments, for example, are empty, and this kind of takes a long while because all of the tenancy agreement in the municipal housing and in the limited profit housing association are long-term lifetime contracts. If we now look into the private renter sector and the ownership sector, it's a bit of a different setting, and it's also a very diverse setting. If we look into the Innerfavoriten area, we see on the one hand the typical structure of the Viennese historic building with tenants inside, so private rental apartments. But there is also an increase in the last couple of years of owner-occupied apartments and condominiums, or the conversion of these historic buildings into condominiums. And I will now give a bit of an overview of the different views of the actors we talked to within the private rental sector, or within the private sector and the historic buildings. So on the one hand, when we talk to real estate developers, they discuss the restrictive policies on demolition and attic conversion when it comes to densification, and that they would prevent financing, decarbonisation and greening measures, to guarantee also that the rent caps that Michael has talked about can actually be still in place for sitting tenants. So there has been a tension between that these densification measures would actually allow for decarbonisation to be financed from the view of real estate developers. If we talk from the Public Renovation Fund that I've mentioned before, that was introduced in 1984, who are actually managing all the fundings for renovation, they also observed that there is a rise of developers that are kind of trying to circumvent the funding requirements. As I've talked before, the funding requirements for renovations are always kind of closely connected to requirements, for example, to keep rent caps. And these developers kind of find ways to kind of go around these funding requirements. Also, the rise in land prices and financialization practices were also mentioned as kind of important obstacles why certain renovation and retrofitting was not going on in the area. And then I've mentioned that there is also a growing share of owner-occupiers in the area. And it's very difficult for condominiums to be converted into decarbonized heating systems and kind of introduce these measures because of the condominium law that kind of prevents or restricts the possibilities to kind of carry on the decarbonization measures, despite the subsidies actually that would be available. And there is also, in our interviews, there was also mentioned that there is also a low economic capacity of some of those owner-occupiers in the area to finance the decarbonization. And the fourth actor that we kind of wanted to give a voice to was tenant protection organizations, but also the urban renewal offices that we talked to. And they observed in the past years in the area also more pressure on tenants due to the fixed term tenancy that was mentioned at the beginning, that is kind of applied also well in Vienna wide, and the rise of complaints on tenant harassment and displacement, as we see as an effect of this liberalization of the tenancy law. If we now look at what does it mean in terms of retrofitting and decarbonization in Vienna, on the obstacles, but also on the challenges or the opportunities that we face, we kind of summarize the opportunities on the one hand as there are long-established institutions in Vienna for renovation and urban renewal, as I've presented before in the timeline. So those institutions you can really count on as institutions that could and can and do develop these decarbonization measures and strategies. On the other hand, as I've mentioned, there are established programs and funding schemes that are being adapted to decarbonization. And then we have the large share of municipal housing and limited profit housing providers that is actually that actually open the opportunity for large scale transformation and decarbonization because of the huge amount of existing building stock they have. And there is existing technical, financial, and social know-how for the implementation within what we call a culture of affordable housing. So going back to the idea of the soft urban renewal as not something that is just a technical challenge to improve the physical housing stock, but always keeping in mind a social aspect within these transformation processes. But as we've heard already talking about the different actors, there are a number of obstacles along with these decarbonization and retrofitting measures. On the one hand, we have the long-term renovation procedures for the projects that are in contradiction a bit with the short-term programs such as Vienna Plus, who was in the area for just 3 years. And also a contradiction to the fluctuating funding landscape on, for example, a national level where funds are announced or then are ended after the legislation period of the recent government. Then another obstacle is, on the one hand, the difficulty to imply the large-scale implementation within the current tenancy protection measures. So, for example, the accessibility of flats that I mentioned in order to really implement physically the decarbonization and heating systems. And then, on the other hand, we have cost-based rent and the strict rent caps as financial barriers to boost renovation, as it was mentioned by our interview partners. And there are a number of legal barriers where we could see that the legal foundations are not apt for the decarbonization and retrofitting, for example, when it comes to multi-unit housing of owner-occupants, but also in the rental sector. So these have been some of the aspects and some glimpses that we encountered in our interviews and in our research when it comes to retrofitting and decarbonization measures. And I will now hand over to Michael to discuss densification and also greening and nature-based solution in Vienna.
Okay, thanks again. So the case study of Nordbahnhof is, as already said, kind of a representative example for densification and also for the implementation of nature-based solutions, because it's embedded in a larger development of the Nordbahnhof, which has been a railway yard that has been not used for several years. And then the Austrian Federal Railways decided, together also with the city of Vienna, to redevelop this area. And it's located close to the Danube. And what we have looked at actually is kind of a third round of development. So what you can see, it's that one in the middle that is a bit with not with a dotted line. The dotted lines in the east are the first developments, and on the other side, it's kind of a development that is following, that is still also kind of one of the latest, largest inner city railway areas that it's being developed. But why we have chosen this particular area, this third development, is because already it was a kind of a revision of an urban design concept. And in the 1990s, the original urban design concept, which you can see on the left bottom picture, foresaw a block perimeter concept. So there were a lot of streets and the green spaces were rather scattered around. And then circumstances also changed during because also the Austrian Federal Railways, they didn't needed additional railway lines. So the city of Vienna and also together with the Austrian Federal Railway Systems, they decided to kind of launch an urban design competition, a European-wide one, to collect some ideas on how an alternative urban design concept might look like. And this, what you see on the right, is kind of the outcome of it. So what the concept did is to foresaw a huge area in the middle, which is free. It's called kind of the free center or the freie Mitte, and it should be used as an urban park or as a green space, an open space. While at the edges of this free center, the housing should be concentrated, but more in a densified matter with high rises and also higher buildings. But the kind of the usable floor area would be the same as in the old concept. So not really more housing, but other organized and more densely organized at the edges of this area. So we thought that this would be a nice case to study this relation between densification and nature-based solutions. So, and this original idea was proposed by Studio Fly and some other actors within this urban design competition, but it was further developed together with the city of Vienna into a kind of an approved urban design concept, which was then approved in 2014. And in between that, there was also a participatory process over a year with different formats of large meetings and also smaller settings that work on thematic groups. And besides experts from the city of Vienna, planning experts and independent experts, architects, landscape planners, also a jury of representatives from the citizens were selected. So there were 36 citizens that participated throughout the entire participation process, kind of representing the needs of civil society, or not the needs, but maybe also the demands. And there were also some neighborhood initiatives or more organized forms of citizens involved in this process. And according to our interviews, not much changed with the original proposed concept, but it was kind of more like slight refinements and slight emphasis, changes in emphasis, also when it comes to the free center, which should be kept kind of as a more wild urban area with some heritage elements of the former railway stations. So this had an impact on the approved urban design concept. And all of this process, and I think this is also very important, was then published in the handbook for further development. So it's a very comprehensive documentation of this urban design competition and its results and its transformation into a design concept. And this was also accompanied by the installation of a strategic management unit at the city of Vienna that dealt with the development of Nordbahnhof. So I now want to first go a bit more into depth into the development of this nature-based solutions of the free center of this urban park, and then afterwards go a bit more into depth into the edge, the built environment that has been planned around this free center. So what the original concept argued for is that the savings in road construction, when you think of this block perimeter organization, kind of can be invested in establishing this big park, which is 10 hectares of green space, and obviously some parts needed to be cleaned up, and also the savings could be invested into maintaining this green space. So after this process of developing this urban design concept, there were some detailed landscape planning concepts developed in the years of 2017 and 18. And there were some also additional participatory elements. And what kind of was the outcome is a rather layered approach that kind of tries to be something in between, with some more areas that are left more wild, some wilderness areas, which are like more in the north of the picture we see here, and some kind of more urban park-oriented landscaped elements into this, in the south and also at the edges of this element. So the outcome was kind of it looks like a compromise in the end, with different elements being located and embedded within this big open space. But within this role, also there was a crucial role of residents and neighborhood initiatives that always kind of, at least to the information we gathered through the interviews, demanded this coherence with the urban design concept, which kind of states already this preservation of wilderness, and also like using these historic landmarks, like the railway tracks that are still present there, and also other elements that stem from this era of a former railway yard, which also some other concepts also declared that this should be completely removed and redone after all. So it was kind of a balanced approach also to work with the elements that were already there and also with the nature that developed within this vacant lot. And there were also some issues argued by officials that because of liability issues, for instance, the railway tracks couldn't be there. They should be removed, yeah. So, and there were this always ongoing negotiations, and the neighborhood initiatives and the role of the residents, they were like crucial in preserving and making this happen in the end. So this is also reflected kind of some administrative challenges within the city of Vienna. And this starts with, okay, how to zone this area, which is kind of more wild, more nature oriented. So they were challenging, should we zone it as an urban park? Or is it like something more oriented to nature protection categories? So in the end, a very specific category was invented, calling nature and recreational space. So kind of also having a kind of flexibility in maintenance, because like an urban park is maintained by a specific administrative unit where the budget comes from the districts. Whereas like more nature-oriented or nature protection categories are administered by the central budget and by different administrative units. So there were a lot of discussions, okay, who takes care of maintaining this area in the end. So also these financing challenges needed to be clarified. And this were some examples of ongoing struggles also in a well-organized city of Vienna, where this more demanding concept of putting wild areas into an kind of central urban park demanded some changes within the administration. Okay, I now want to focus on the kind of built edge and how the housing was developed there and how the land was put forward for this housing. So in 2016, the contractual foundations were laid, and this was done by a framework agreement between the city of Vienna and the Austrian Federal Railways, which were then still be property owner. And there were issues like, okay, financing to social infrastructure in general. There were also some regulations put in place about affordable housing or subsidized housing, what should be the amount of it, and stuff like that. And then as a second part, there were contracts between the Austrian Federal Railways as the property owner and the Property Development Consortium, which consisted of a different set of housing developers and also an insurance company and non-profit housing developers, so quite a mix. But learning from previous examples like the Hauptbahnhof, which was already mentioned by Judith, the Austrian Federal Railways were interested in selling the land to a consortium and not to individual housing developers. And they did it like then lot by lot. But for them, this was kind of a learning to rather have one kind of board or consortium that you can deal with instead a myriad of housing developers individually. So, and after having laid those foundations, the development started with detailing the property developments for 8 building lots. So, and the consortium buys gradually land or acquires them from the Austrian Federal Railways. So there are still some lots that have not been sold up to date, but still are in the process of doing that. So, but kind of what the development entailed was first to create some detailed development structure for this 8 building lots. And this also led to some renegotiations where these high rises should be located. So in comparison to the concept, which foresaw like 8 high rises, the number was lower to 6 originally, because the developers realized that this was not so easy to be done within the funded system, subsidized system. They should operate. So there were always these negotiations also with the city of Vienna in a very constructive way to also reorganize the building lots. And what the developer consortium also did was to introduce architectural competitions and also establish a quality assurance advisory board with also representatives from the city of Vienna, from the housing developers, independent architects, but also representatives from civil society, like neighborhood initiatives, which always commented on the developments. So, and after having established these instruments, the zoning of the plots kind of followed these outcomes of these competitions and the quality assurance board. So what was the outcome, or what is being built today is kind of a mixed housing tenure. And the aim was to have a mixed tenure for the whole Nordbahnhof, which is kind of 1/3 free financed, 1/3 is affordable rent, which is kind of a specific rent agreement that was also developed during this process of development. And this is kind of a negotiated agreement with the city of Vienna on a rent cap that is slightly higher than the classic subsidized rents. And this is indexed with 2017 and is slightly higher in high rises because there the maintenance costs are more. So, but still it was important also for the housing developers to offer unlimited contracts. And when exiting such kind of an affordable rent agreement, they have a running time of 20 years. And for these 20 years, the housing developers need to adhere to this at affordable rents. And they can only be changed afterwards, after these 20 years, but also only when the contract will be renewed for the tenants. So kind of this was kind of a middle, how to say, kind of an agreement to overcome this slightly higher housing construction costs, also from high rises, and still kind of making these apartments very affordable. And this was also, as we have been told with the interviews, important to the developer competition to kind of provide affordable rents. And the other third is kind of the classic subsidized rent, which also includes smart apartments, where you have lower tenant contributions and are more accessible to lower income residents. So in the end, the tenure, and this is kind of a provisionally figures that we compiled by the information provided from the housing developers, is that then for the Freie Mitte, it's like around 50%, which is owner occupation or private rent, and 8% are this affordable rent, and 30% still fall into the subsidized rent system, and 10% are not yet defined. So, but these figures kind of more like estimations than probably actual numbers, so they should be judged cautiously, probably. So, but what does this mean, this development, for the accessibility for lower income groups, especially? We kind of concluded that through this combination of a very central location and the tenure provided, accessibility is slightly skewed towards middle and higher income residents. But still, there is this awareness and commitment also by the developer consortium to provide housing to low income residents. And this, on the basic level, the 30% for a kind of are realized via this classic instruments of subsidized housing that is provided by limited profit housing associations. So I now want to finalize with some general concluding remarks. This is that the decarbonization in the housing sector remains particularly challenges because of this mix of building related conditions that are very individually for the plots and general legal constraints. This goes back to the case study that Judith presented on Innerfavoriten. While the adaptation, like nature-based solutions and also densification measures, they remain challenging in their implementation due to various reasons. And this is like administrative traditions, but also clarifications of public financing streams, so small adaptations that are needed to really implement those strategies and policy objectives we see on a strategic level. But, and this is maybe the positive take on Vienna, is that the housing quality, either newly built or after a renovation, can be considered high, and this is a really improvement for also the tenants. And this is, in our conclusion, because of the strong housing regulation. It is because of object-based subsidies and the strong planning system that kind of created a culture of affordable housing provision, where the accessibility to low-income residents are provided at a basic level of this, mostly of this 30%. So that is kind of a culture that exists in the city and also drives housing developments to a large degree. Okay, so in Austria or in Vienna, it seems that this housing affordability and accessibility issues are not the main challenges in the green transition. It's rather really implement and demand for these green measures to be as high of quality as possible. And this was kind of our takeaway message also within this lecture series, which we already covered and heard challenges and opportunities and case studies from Italy and Norway. And we will continue doing that in January with Switzerland. And then in the summer term, we will also have cases being presented from Hungary, Poland, Spain, and the UK. So in summary, stay tuned, and thank you for your attention.